The last few months, I can be sure that all of us have had moments where we just wanted to stick our head out of the window and scream at the top of our lungs, right? This pandemic has been absolutely insane. And the political situation in this country that's developing right now has been absolutely insane. And if you are somebody who is conscious of politics in the way that all of us are, if you're somebody that's part of a community like the community that we're building, if you're somebody who understands the way the universe works, your head just wants to explode. I mean, you must just be like, what is going to happen next? How can we continue this way? I mean, there must be parts of you that just want to blow up. So I want everyone to just take a deep breath, breathe in, breathe out. We're here. You're among friends, you're among comrades, you're among brothers and sisters. And we're going to, for the next little bit, just kind of engage about what this project, the Center for Political Innovation, is, and how it could have an impact amid this ongoing crisis of capitalism. So forget about all the fears you may have for the moment. Forget about paying your bills. Forget about any tension you might have with a relative or a romantic partner or somebody in your life. Put your worries about your job aside. Put your worries about the future aside. Put your anxiety about this upcoming election and the turmoil in the country. Put all of that aside for just a few minutes and let's engage. Let's have a conversation. Now, folks, I really want to give a special shout out, right? Because, I have organized with people of all different ages in the past. I learned Marxism from somebody who was way older than a baby boomer, somebody who could remember the 1930s. But I spent a lot of time with a lot of baby boomer activists who could remember the 1960s and 70s. But I know that there are a number of us that are watching that are either millennials or a Generation Z. And this pandemic, I must say, must be particularly stressful for people who are under the age of 18. Because I can tell you that when I was 17, 16, 15, 14, there was nothing I hated more than just sitting around the house and being bored out of my mind. And there's been a lot of that going on for younger working class people in the last few months. And my heart just absolutely goes out to them. I don't know how you're holding your sanity right now, because I would just be losing my mind if I were stuck in my parents' household at that age amid the pandemic. It would be a moment of great anxiety and frustration for me. When I was young, growing up in a small town in Ohio, one thing that I did to kind of find solace and pass the time is I would study the Little Red Book. This is Mao Zedong's Little Red Book. And this is actually the Little Red Book that I bought when I was 14 years old. I remember, I didn't have a credit card. I was 14. So I put $10 together and I actually went to the post office and got a money order. And I sent the money order to a communist bookstore in Cleveland. And then about 10 days later, they sent me this Little Red Book, the one I'm holding in my hand. They sent it to me in the mail. And it's funny because when you move a lot, which I have moved a lot, and I've been in New York City for a while, and you move from one apartment to another. When you move, you always lose books. But I have not lost this particular book, this Little Red Book, this actual Little Red Book that I bought when I was 15. And so, I was looking through it, and there's a section of the Little Red Book towards the end where it's the chapter about the youth. And I just wanted to read a passage from it. He talks about the youth towards the end of the book. He says, young people are the most active and vital force in society. They are the most eager to learn and the least conservative in their thinking. This is especially so in the era of socialism, but that's not the important part. The part that I wanted to read is this. Mao Zedong says, how shall we judge whether a youth is revolutionary? How can we tell? There can be only one criteria, namely, whether or not he is willing to integrate himself with the broad masses of workers and peasants and does so. If he is willing to do so and actually does so, he is a revolutionary. Now I'm going to read it one more time. How should we judge whether or not a youth is a revolutionary? How can we tell? there can only be one criterion, namely, whether or not he is willing to integrate himself with the broad masses of workers and peasants and does so in practice. If he is willing to do so and actually does so, he is a revolutionary. Now, when I first read those words years ago, I did not really know what they meant. And I don't really think I really started to understand those words for maybe another 10 years, maybe another 12 years, right? I think that your understanding and your depth with these kind of concepts, you might think you understand something the first time you read it, but then you look back 5 years later and you say, wow, I really didn't understand it. And then you read it in another 5 years, and then you say, wow, I really didn't understand it. I tell people that I first started to understand Marxism, to really understand the Marxist dialectical materialist method of analyzing the world during the financial crisis and the aftermath of the financial crisis of 2008, 2009, when I studied William Z. Foster's book on the history of the three internationals. And in that book, he talked about the role of Karl Marx in the American Civil War. Lincoln was not a communist. The Union Army was not going to create socialism. But Karl Marx understood that the struggle to abolish slavery was a progressive struggle, and that if Marxists were going to have an impact, they had to embed themselves with the abolitionists and with Harriet Tubman and with the Union Army. And William Z. Foster talks about the fact that leaders of the Communist International, even though there was so few of them in the United States, were involved in this struggle to abolish slavery. He talked about August Willich and Joseph Wedemeyer, right? And that level of depth was very important to understand. And in that book, you learn about the polemics between Marx and the anarchists, figures like Mikhail Bakunin, figures like Joseph Proudhon, who had a very different understanding of how the world worked than Marx. And while they both shared the same goal of building a stateless and classless world, they had a very different understanding of the methods and how to get there. Now, some of the best advice I ever received was that if you're a Marxist, never say anything that you do not know. However, if you do know something and you know it in your soul, I mean, you absolutely know it to be true, never be afraid to say it. So never say anything that you do not know. But if you do know something and you really know it, don't be afraid to say it as loud as you can. Now, I've actually used that bit of advice in many different fields of life. But, for example, around 9/11, I don't know that the US government, was involved in 9/11. So I don't say that. I don't know that there was some kind of wider conspiracy. So I don't say that. I don't say things that I do not know. However, I do know that there are some things about the official story of 9/11 that don't exactly add up. So I am not afraid to say that. And I am not ashamed to say, now that we have the 28 pages, from Saudi Arabia, there's a lot of things about what we were told about 9/11 that don't add up. I know that, so I can say it. I don't say what I don't know. I only say what I do know, right? This is an important understanding. And it's a very valuable way of understanding things. I don't know who is going to win the upcoming presidential election. I don't know at this point. I do not know how soon the big economic fallout that is coming as a result of the pandemic and the capitalist crisis and the low-wage police state. I don't know when that big fallout is coming. But what I do know is that the US government and the US ruling class have committed themselves to economic policies and economic decisions that are digging their own graves, and that we are heading toward a bigger crisis. I've talked before about how, in a lot of ways, the United States, since the end of the Second World War, has been adopting what you could call Nazi economics. Now, it sounds like a hyperbolic term, right? It sounds, a little extreme. But if you understand fascism and you understand Adolf Hitler and the Nazi regime in Germany, there was a certain economic approach that they applied in order to carry out and effectively rule Germany and lead to the great catastrophe known as the Second World War, to commit the horrendous mass murder known as the Holocaust, there was a certain economic philosophy that the Nazis preached. And it came from Halmer Schacht. One of the best books I ever read on the history of Nazi Germany was called Hitler's Banker. And it was a biography. It wasn't about Goebbels. It wasn't about various figures that are associated with it. It wasn't even really about Hitler. It was about Halmer Schacht, Hitler's banker. And he was the economist of Nazi Germany, right? In the 1920s, Germany was having a capitalist crisis, just like every other Western country was at that point, the Great Depression. And so there was a feeling that the government needed to take action on some level to stabilize the economy, right? There was fear in Germany that the massive Communist Party might take power, might build socialism in Germany, there might be a revolution. There was fear that continuing instability might spill over into the rest of Europe. There was a feeling that they needed to do something. The capitalist class needed to do something in order to stabilize the economy. And so, it was decided by the Nazis when they took power that the government was going to spend a lot of money in order to stabilize the economy. But the question was, what would they spend the money on? And the Nazi state made the decision to spend the money on two things: prisons and military production, right? The Nazis took power. They outlawed the Communist Party. They outlawed the Social Democratic Party. They rounded up all the people that were leaders of the Communist Party, all the people that were leaders of the Social Democratic Party, and they put them in concentration camps. And they spent a lot of money to build these concentration camps. And they gave a lot of jobs to a lot of people to be guards in these concentration camps. And so all the people that were in the concentration camps were no longer unemployed and looking for a job because they were in a concentration camp. And all the people that were hired to build these concentration camps were no longer unemployed. They were, setting up concentration camps. And all these people that worked as guards in these concentration camps, they were no longer unemployed. They were working as guards in the concentration camps. And so you drastically reduced unemployment. And the Nazi state also decided that they were going to pull out of the Treaty of Versailles. They were going to start rebuilding Germany's military and rebuilding the weapons of war and the implements of destruction, rebuilding an air force, rebuilding guns and tanks and planes. And so, of course, many people that were previously unemployed got jobs building military equipment, were hired and worked in the so-called defense industry, or they from there, maybe they ended up joining the German military. They started building. So the way the German fascist state was able to stabilize the economy of Germany in the 1930s was by investing in destruction, right? They said, we are going to stabilize the economy of Germany. We are going to rebuild the German economy from the capitalist crisis by putting huge sections of the population in prisons and building a huge prison apparatus and building a huge military apparatus. In essence, the economic basis of Nazism was that you can stimulate and stabilize a capitalist economy through destruction. Prisons are institutions of destruction. Military spending, war, tanks, those are, bombs. These things are implements of destruction. And Nazi economics is how they were able to create a temporary economic boom in Germany that ultimately only lasted maybe 4 or 5, 6 years at the most. And by 1939, Europe was heading off to the Second World War, one of the greatest catastrophes in human history. And that after the Second World War in the United States, many people observed that in the United States, we saw the rise of something called the military-industrial complex. In fact, US President Eisenhower even warned about the danger of a military-industrial complex, because it seemed like the way the US capitalist economy was continuing to move ahead was by doing the same thing that the Nazis had done, by spending lots of money on the military, right? That the military spending, military manufacturing became so essential to the US economy that it was almost impossible for a president to stop the country from going to war, because war was what the US economy was all about. Now, unlike Nazi Germany, they didn't create it really fast. It wasn't created in like 1 year. It was a gradual process throughout the 1950s and up into the 60s, building a whole economy centered around a military industrial complex. And then we know in the 1970s, in the late 1970s, after the political upsurge of the 1960s, after there was starting to be the process of deindustrialization in the United States, as living standards were starting to go down, as after the post-war economic expansion came to an end, we saw the creation gradually, again, not immediately like the Nazis did, but gradually, of a prison industrial complex, right? Of a system of prisons for profit, where economies were stimulated, people were hired, the workforce was cleared of unemployed workers by locking people in jail. And all across the United States, we saw the rate of incarceration rising as an economic stimulus. So since the end of the Second World War, the United States has been committed to Nazi economics. That the US leaders have decided that the way that they're going to stabilize the capitalist economy, the naturally unstable economy of profits in command, the way that they're going to stabilize it is by using the Nazi method, by using methods of destruction, building up tanks and bombs and guns, engaging in confrontations and big wars around the world, beating down countries around the world with war, and impoverishing and destroying the lives of their population, and turning human beings into a way to make profits through building up a low-wage police state. The ruling class of the United States has tried to stabilize capitalism with Nazi economics. And just like in Nazi Germany, it only worked for 5 or 6 years, and then World War II happened because their economy was about to fall apart. Just like in the United States, 2008, 2009, the economy came crashing down, right? The housing bubble burst, right? People say, what happened? What happened with the housing bubble burst? Why did this happen? Well, it happened because the living standards of average Americans were going down. Americans, they just didn't have the ability to buy cars and TV sets and houses like they once did. And, in the Federal Reserve, there was a panic going on. They were panicking because Americans just couldn't spend money like they once did. I don't know if folks remember. I remember that after 9/11, George W. Bush, who was the president of the United States, he was asked, what can Americans do if they want to help in the aftermath of 9/11? And George W. Bush said, if you want to defeat Al-Qaeda, you got to go shopping. Go shopping. That's how you can defeat the terrorists. And it was the dumbest thing. And people are like, go shopping? What is he talking about? But what George W. Bush was talking about, why he said that, was because in the back room with Alan Greenspan, the protege of Ayn Rand, the sociopath who did not believe in altruism and compassion, the protege of Ayn Rand, Alan Greenspan, was telling George W. Bush, you got to get them to spend money. The economy is going to crash if you don't get them to spend money. They were panicking inside the Federal Reserve because Americans weren't spending money. Why were Americans not spending money? Because our wages have been going down for a few decades. Because we have record rates of student debt and household debt. Because our neighborhoods don't even have paved roads in some cases. They're unpaving the roads throughout the United States. Why were Americans not spending money? When you drive the wages of Americans down, when you drive the wages of working people down, their ability to spend decreases. The working class is also the consumers. And if you drive the living standards and the wages of working people down, pretty soon they can't buy back all the products that they are producing. And you have a classic crisis of overproduction. So Alan Greenspan was there in the Federal Reserve. He was whispering in the ear of George W. Bush and telling him to tell Americans to keep spending. What also happened was there was a huge deregulation of the lending of money. And all kinds of easy credit, lending practices, were legalized because there was a desperation to keep Americans spending. And, the mortgage crisis was based on the fact that eventually, after so many, predatory mortgage housing loans had been spent, pretty soon the country was glutted with houses that could not be sold. Pretty soon you had, homes all over the United States being foreclosed. And you actually got a situation in 2008, 2009, where in Nevada, outside of Las Vegas, there was a tent city that was erected. All these families that had their homes foreclosed and were homeless were living in tents outside of the city of Las Vegas in Nevada. And they're living in tents, right? And what was going on there was you had a situation where thousands of Americans were homeless because there were too many houses, right? That was the 2008 financial collapse, a situation where people were homeless all across the United States, not because there was a shortage of housing, but because there were too many houses. This is the irrationality of capitalism. Only under capitalism can people be homeless because there are too many houses. Only under capitalism can people be hungry and starve because there's too much food. This is the irrationality of a system of profits in command. And this is the crisis that we are facing here in the United States. Now, another good bit of advice that I got, the person told me never to say anything that I do not know, but if I do know something, to never be afraid to say it. The same person also gave me the advice. They said, it wasn't really advice, it was just a fact. But sometimes you have to choose. Sometimes in life, you reach a moment where you have to choose. You have to make a decision. And I remember the summer that Barack Obama was elected, I actually had an internship. I was working with communist activists in Detroit to work against home foreclosures. We were trying to get a bill passed to stop home foreclosures in the state of Michigan, to declare a moratorium on home foreclosures. And I was staffing the office. There's a Methodist church that's in downtown Detroit, right next to the stadium. I worked in that office, and we were trying our hardest to get this bill passed that would stop home foreclosures in the state of Michigan. And I remember one day our phone rang, and there was a woman on the phone, a woman of color, and she was sobbing. And she said, we're getting foreclosed. I mean, we're getting kicked out of our house. And she was panicking. She didn't know what was going on. So, down the hall from the office where I was working on, there was the Detroit Welfare Rights Union, which was a group that worked with low-income people. We got her on the phone. We said, what happened? Well, she didn't own her home. She rented her home. She had 2 children. She rented her home, and she'd been paying her rent just like she was supposed to, paying her rent to her landlord. Her landlord had not told her that the bank was foreclosing on the house she was living in. So this whole time she's paying her rent just like she's supposed to. The landlord's coming and taking the check, never telling her that on a certain date, the bank is going to come and clear the property and kick people out. And so this woman had no idea that her housing situation was in danger, no idea that anything was going on. She had just been paying her rent like normal. And suddenly one morning, she's getting ready to go to work, and there's the sheriff knocking on her door saying, you got to be out because we're gonna, this house is foreclosed. The landlord, is being foreclosed on. So she's panicking. So of course we get in our car, we go over there, folks from the Welfare Rights Union, folks from the moratorium campaign. We're standing there at the house, and there's the sheriff there, and he's like, I hate this. This is my job, but this building is foreclosed. The bank is foreclosing. You got to get out of here. And she's crying, and she's saying, I've got 2 kids here. I've been paying my rent. This isn't right. And so there was a moment there, right, where communist activists were standing there. What are we going to do, right? And the sheriff is saying, we gotta move. You got to get your stuff out. And so we had a moment there. And I looked at the older guy. It was a guy named Alan, an older middle-aged guy, former auto worker who would have these long layoffs. And so he would do volunteer activist work. I looked at the woman from the Welfare Rights Union, and we all had the exact same thought in that moment. It's one of those moments where you have to choose. With the sheriff standing there, and all of us walked up to the porch, and we sat down on the porch, sending the message that, hey, you're going to move in on this woman. You're going to have to deal with us. And that was the moment. Now, what then happened? The sheriff looks there. He's one sheriff. He says, well, I'm coming back. He says, I'm coming back in a few hours. So we were able to get a progressive judge who was an ally of the progressive movement in Detroit on the phone. That progressive judge was able to issue an injunction, and we stopped this woman from being kicked out of her home, right? We actually stopped it. And it was a victorious moment, and it felt really good. And later that summer, we were involved in a struggle. There was a woman who had a predatory loan. Her name was Ruby Curl Pinkins, and she got her whole church out there. And it was a progressive struggle. We stopped this home foreclosure. It was a victory. It was a big moment. And it was community struggles like that And at that moment, you know, when those community struggles were going on, when I was studying Marxism, I was studying Lenin, I was studying Marxist theory, but I was also, you know, involved in these struggles, that I started to maybe have a little bit more of an understanding of what Mao said in the Little Red Book when he said, how should we judge whether or not a youth is revolutionary? How can you tell? There can only be one criteria, namely whether or not he's willing to integrate himself with the broad masses of workers and peasants and does so in practice. If he is willing to do so and actually does so, he is a revolutionary. Now, there are other moments, though, where I was forced to think of Mao's words. There were other moments where I started to have a deeper understanding. You know, I have heard my whole life, and I'm sure you've heard your whole life too, that communism has failed everywhere it's ever been tried. Never has any society in history ever been successful with a socialist government. Just completely failed. This is repeated throughout the country of the United States as fact, right? It is undisputed fact. Everywhere socialism has ever been implemented, it has been complete and an utter complete failure. It's never worked. It fails everywhere it's ever been tried. Well, no, I don't know exactly what every detail was about the Soviet Union and whether or not every allegation against the Soviet Union is true or false. I don't know exactly if every allegation they make against Mao is explicitly true or explicitly false. I don't know. I don't know in detail everything that went on in the history of the 20th century and Marxist-Leninist governments. I know there's a lot of lies and blatant lies that are told about socialist countries. I also know that there's a lot of mistakes that have been made, so I don't know the specifics. But what I do know is that this notion that socialism has failed everywhere it's ever been tried is so utterly ridiculous. It's laughable. In 1917, Russia was an agrarian, impoverished society. By the 1930s, it was an industrial powerhouse. It had electrified the country. It was producing more steel than any other country in the world. It had some of the largest hydroelectrical power plants in the world. By the 1960s, even after a horrendous world war that killed 26 million people, they rebuilt and they were fully industrialized, and they were helping countries like Egypt and Syria and other countries around the world to industrialize and build up millions of people raised out of poverty, healthcare for the population, universal employment, wiping out illiteracy. There is no way you can say that the Soviet Union was an economic failure. The Soviet Union had problems, but it was an economic success if there ever has been. A whole country was rapidly raised up from poverty and transformed. And the same thing is true for China. You know, China used to be called the sick man of Asia, right? They used to talk about China as a country where people died all the time from famines. There would be famines all the time because they didn't have a strong central government, because they didn't have their own industries, because the fields in China that should have been growing crops to feed people were instead growing opium poppies because the British had forced the opium trade onto them. So all over the world, China was known as being one of the poorest countries in the world. And now we look at China today, it is the second largest economy in the world. And it is the Chinese Communist Party and their leadership that has raised China up from poverty and made it into a global superpower. China, at this point, has a largely state-run economy. I always laugh. It's very funny. You know, people who think that Obamacare is communism, if you point out China's economic successes, will always insist China is capitalist. Well, I mean, Obamacare, I mean, there's no government health care, no public option. Somehow that's communism. But China, with state-run banks, state-run industries, 5-year economic plans, a ruling communist party, somehow China, it must be capitalist. Well, China is not capitalist. Capitalism is a system in which the means of production only function as preliminary transformation into capital, meaning that production is only carried out so that those who own the major centers of economic power can make profits. In China, there is a state central plan that guides production, and even the private sector is not operating simply according to what's profitable. Even the private sector is closely regulated and controlled by the state. The Chinese Communist Party, which is based in communities, which has over 90 million members, is actively guiding the economy. And they have made mistakes, and they have problems with corruption and other things. But there is no question in my mind that just as the Soviet Union was a socialist society, China today is a socialist society. And it's not only It's not only China that has had economic successes with socialism. You look at Libya. Prior to the 2011 war, Libya was the most prosperous country on the African continent. I mean, it was the country on the African continent that provided healthcare to its population, that provided universal employment. They built the largest irrigation system in the world, the Great Man-Made River. Prior to 2011, people from all over Africa were actually trying to get into Libya. In fact, that was one of the main grievances during the revolution, was that a lot of these wealthy people who didn't like Gaddafi were complaining about the fact there were so many dark-skinned guest workers from all over the African continent who would come to Libya. Prior to 2011, when Libya was a socialist country, people from all over Africa were trying to get in to Libya because they wanted the benefits of what socialism had created, what the Islamic socialist system of Gaddafi had created. But now that Libya has been forced to join the global free market system, the global capitalist system, the system of profits and command with NATO bombs, now that the Great Man-Made River, the largest irrigation system in the world that socialism constructed, has been bombed to pieces, now that the World Bank and the IMF and the United Nations have got their foothold into Libya, now that the imperialists have sunk their fangs into Libya, things have gotten so bad that people are trying to get out, right? That people die drowning in the Mediterranean trying to get out of Libya. Under socialism, people were trying to get into Libya. Under capitalism, people are risking their lives and dying trying to get out of Libya. And they want to tell us that capitalism is the answer, that the free market system is the answer, that their next regime change operation is the answer. I think we can look at the situation in Libya and make a decision for ourselves. Now, I think I want to get to, things that you haven't all heard before. And forgive me, I know a lot of you watch these broadcasts, so you've heard all of this before many times. But I want to get to the essence of this broadcast, because this is the first web conference that we've had for the Center for Political Innovation. And, people have asked, why are you doing this, Caleb? Why are you creating the Center for Political Innovation? Why don't you create a new communist party? Why don't you start a newspaper and go out and sell your newspaper everywhere? And why don't you get a permit and have a cage and have some protests? Why don't you try to, run an election campaign where you're on the ballot in one state? Why don't you do what communists have been doing in the United States for the last 100 years with so little success? Well, because it's not working. And I think what we need to understand here, what we really need to understand here, is that every successful movement towards socialism that I have ever seen has begun with a big change in how the socialist movement operates, right? Take the Russian Revolution, for example. Russian Revolution, you had a Marxist party in Russia, the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, and they engaged in bowing to spontaneity. Whenever there was an uprising or a strike among the population, they would go and support it and hand out their leaflets and explain that capitalism was the problem, and they would just tail after whatever the masses did. Whenever there was an uprising among the peasants, they would run after it and say, "Wow, we Marxists, we support it." And they had a bunch of different newspapers, and just basically whenever there was some kind of spontaneous rebellion in Russia, the Marxists would show up and say they supported it, and it was here. They would go there, they would run there, they would run there, whatever was happening in general, they would just run after it. They call it tailism. But Lenin had the idea that instead of engaging in tailism, instead of bowing to spontaneity, that they should develop what he called a party of a new type. And that this party of a new type would operate in a completely different way. It would, practice this theory he developed called democratic centralism, where they all coordinated their activities. It would engage in agitation. It would engage in propaganda. It would agitate to the masses, and it would propagate to the advanced. And it would be one step ahead of the workers. It wouldn't be running behind them, but it would be one step ahead of them, raising progressive demands, raising demands of workers, right? That was the idea. And in 1903, Lenin gathered a group of communists together, and he said to them, "Hey, I'm going to build this party of a new type." And the majority of the people in the room was in London, the majority of the people in the room said they would go along with it. And they were called the majority. And the people who didn't want to go along with it, they were the minority. They were called the minority. The word for majority in Russian is Bolshevik. The word for minority in Russian is Menshevik. And so the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party was divided into two factions. Those who wanted to go along with Lenin's new theory of a party of a new type, they became the Bolsheviks. And those who wanted to stay in the old way, continue doing what the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party had done, continue bowing to spontaneity, they became the Mensheviks. And it was that moment, that shift, that marked the beginning of Russia actually moving towards socialism. If they had just continued to do things in the old way, there would never have been a Russian Revolution, right? And it was that decision that the old way is not working, that we need to develop a new way, we need to apply a new way, and we need to utilize these methods that made the Russian Revolution. And let me add that there's a reason Lenin developed his theory of the party of a new type, because in Russia there's a long tradition of secret society. So, there was the Decembrists, for example, that worked and conspired against Tsar Nicholas I. There was the Old Believers, which was like a religious organization that rejected some of the reforms in the Russian Orthodox Church, and that most of the population of Russia at that time was illiterate. And the idea that you would form some kind of secret society or monastic order among the educated revolutionaries that would engage in agitation and propaganda, looking at the situation in Russia in the 1900s, it made sense. Right? So they decided they had figured out something that made sense for Russia in their time, and they decided to change the way they operated very dramatically in order to apply it, and they did it. And that's where the Russian Revolution came from. You look at the Chinese Revolution, right? The Chinese Communist Party had supported correctly the KMT movement, right? In China, there was this leader named Dr. Sun Yat-sen. He was a progressive and a forward-thinking leader, and he built a mass movement of the nationalist or the KMT movement in China based on three principles: democracy, independence, and the people's livelihood. And that third thing, the people's livelihood, people understood that somehow meant some kind of socialism, but it was unclear. And so this was a broad democratic movement in China to build a modern China, to break China out of the rule of foreign corporations and foreign banks. But it was a broad movement, and the communists joined that movement. But Mao, who was a member of the Chinese Communist Party, and he was an alternate member of the National Committee of the KMT. He carried out that line of joining the KMT movement. Mao was from the countryside, and he wrote a very important document, which I would encourage anyone to read if you want to understand the history of the Chinese Revolution. And it's called Reports from an Investigation of the Peasant Uprisings in Hunan. And Mao, he's been operating in the cities. He's been a communist organizer, building trade unions in the cities, being part of the KMT nationalist movement. He goes to the countryside in Hunan, where there's been this rebellion among the peasants. And he sees the anger of the Chinese peasantry, right? And he says, this is where the revolution is going to come from. It's this anger of peasants who their whole life have been degraded and not allowed to lift up their heads. It's their anger that is going to lead to the overthrow of capitalism and the creation of socialism in China. It is their anger. And he writes this essay in 1926. And if you read the essay, he's burning in anger, not just at the oppression that these peasants suffer, but at the Chinese Communist Party. Because the Chinese Communist Party is ignoring the peasant uprisings that are taking place in Hunan, right? They have the attitude that these peasants, they're illiterate, they're peasants, so they aspire to become capitalists. They own their own property. They're not factory workers. It doesn't fit the formula that the Communist International has given us. So the Chinese Communist Party is ignoring the rebellions among the peasantry. And so Mao writes this essay burning with anger, just burning with anger, because he says, look, when the masses are in motion, you have three choices. You can ignore them. You can follow behind them, gesticulating and criticizing, or you can march to the front and lead them. And every Chinese is free to choose. This is what he writes in his essay, right? And he's angry at the Chinese Communist Party because they're ignoring this huge uprising. That's where the quote, that essay, there's a famous quote that I'm sure you've all heard before. He says, "A single spark can light a prairie fire," right? And Mao is urging the Chinese Communist Party to turn around, to change the direction it's moving in order to make a revolution. That if they're going to have socialism in China, they can't just copy what the Bolsheviks did in Russia. They need to develop a formula. They need to develop a method that specifically applies to China in their time. And they need to go to the peasantry, the real powder keg. And that's where the revolution is going to come to. Mao has that understanding. And eventually, Mao fights against many different factions, and he eventually develops the strategy of going to the peasantry, of carving out liberated territory. They eventually established the Chinese Soviet Republic briefly during the early 1930s. They eventually then joined an alliance against the Japanese invaders. And ultimately, the Chinese Revolution happened because the Chinese Communist Party turned around. It changed its tactics very dramatically. It stopped organizing and operating in the old way. And it shifted in order to develop a strategy that applied to their conditions in that country, in that time, in order to actually move towards socialism. There would be no Russian Revolution. There would be no Chinese Revolution if they had just continued to operate in the old way. If they hadn't engaged in political innovation, and started to change the way they were operating, there would never have been socialism in Russia or in China, right? And if you look at the way things are going in the United States right now, there needs to be a shift. There needs to be a shift. The issue now, I've heard my whole life, if people were just out in the streets, things would be better. People were just out in the streets. We need average Americans to get off their butts and get out into the streets. We need big protests happening. There are big protests happening right now all across the United States. All the time, there are big protests happening, right? Or I've heard this before. We need average Americans to understand that capitalism is the problem. Well, look at the polls right now that have been coming out. Millions and millions and millions of Americans realize that capitalism is the problem. So there's millions of Americans protesting right now in the streets. There's millions of Americans who realize capitalism is the problem. But we're not getting any closer to socialism in the United States, right? And in fact, things are getting particularly bad. I noticed, that there's one of the old Trotskyite sects. I hate to pick on them, but they're not really. They may not even be around anymore to be offended by it. But the Spartacist League. Have folks ever heard of the Spartacist League? Well, the last issue of their newspaper was published back in May, and on August 18th, on their website, they announced that their publication would be irregular, and we've heard nothing from them. Right? People are out in the streets protesting. Polls show Americans are opposed to socialism. So this old Trotskyite sectarian group looks like they've dissolved because they don't even know. I mean, they don't even know what to do in a situation like this. This isn't how it's supposed to be, right? You look at a lot of these old Marxist-Leninist groups, the situation has drastically changed. For once, there is widespread anti-capitalist consciousness in the United States. For once, there is a desire to get involved in political activism. And so they don't know what to do. They just have completely fallen apart, right? And there are other groups that are trying to operate and continue to operate in the old way, but they're very confused. And a lot of the younger people who join these groups are very confused, and they don't quite know what to do. And we're facing a situation where the problem right now is not that there's a lack of activism or political involvement, especially among younger people. Younger people from this generation are more politically involved than ever before. And there's not a lack of anti-capitalist consciousness. What there is right now is there is a lack of understanding. There is a lack of ideological theory, and there's a lack of understanding what's going on, and there's a lack of a real understanding of how we can build something that can actually challenge this. And that's the situation that we're in. Now, my vision for the Center for Political Innovation is not to build a new party. It is not to build a new political organization. The idea is not to build something that's going to compete with all these groups, right? Well, don't join the DSA. Don't join the Communist Party. Don't join the PSL. You got to join the CPI. That is not what I want to do. My vision for the CPI is that it'll have people in the DSA. It'll have people in the PSL. It'll have people in the CP. It'll have people in all the different parties talking to it and listening to it. And that we will facilitate the kinds of conversations that need to happen, right? We will enable the socialist movement of the United States to turn around, to change, to move in a new direction, to get things going in a way that can actually get us out of this crisis and start moving towards socialism, because operating the old way is not going to do that. My vision is, we've started with publishing some books, right? The first book we published was The Green Book by Muammar Gaddafi. And I'll tell you, this book has been selling like crazy. And you should read the reviews of this. I mean, Unbelievable. I never thought in a million years that this book would sell as many copies as it has. You know, I also published a book on Kamala Harris. I used Kamala Harris to make a point about socialism and the leftist movement and the confusion and what it means to be left-wing in the United States. But my goal is that we would publish, in addition to publishing these books, all kinds of books. I think we ought to publish a book about the relationship between Christianity and socialism. I think we ought to publish a book about the relationship between Islam and socialism. I think we ought to publish a book about the role of Marxists in the struggle to abolish slavery in the United States. I think we ought to publish a book on Ba'athist Arab socialism and how the Arab people changed socialism and developed a socialism for their society. I think we need to write books and publish books about Bolivarianism and hold conferences understanding how the people of South and Central America have changed socialism in order to apply it to their society, all working towards the development of a socialism with American characteristics, right? In China, they admit that their form of socialism would never work in the United States. They openly say we don't seek to impose our political system on any other country. They recognize that their socialism is a uniquely Chinese socialism. It's socialism with Chinese characteristics. Well, we need to develop a socialism with American characteristics that will apply to our country in our time and actually get us out of this nightmare that capitalism has created. That is what needs to be done. Now, not only do I want us to publish books, I want us to publish my goal, right? This is not something we can achieve overnight. My goal would be for us to publish a daily socialist briefing. If every day we put out an email briefing, you know, with updates about what is happening in the economy, with updates about what is happening internationally, with updates about what is happening in the socialist movement, and that in this briefing, we provided inside information about what's happening in US politics, about what's happening in the economy, about what's happening internationally, inside information that nobody else had. That everybody who is interested in socialism and revolutionary politics in the United States would be, you know, checking out our daily briefings and getting these emails and going, wow, I mean, the CPI, they just figured out that this is happening. They just figured out that this is happening. And we would keep track of all the different socialist tendencies in the United States. We would keep track of the different factions in the ruling class and monitor them. We would keep track of the developments internationally and be tracking all of it and have like the most up-to-date information that the whole socialist movement would be turning to get information from, and that we would be collecting and gathering information that would be really, really valuable, and people would be constantly turning to us for insights, right? My vision is not for us to build a cadre organization. My vision is for us to be the vanguard of the vanguard, the agitator of the agitators, right? That we will have the cutting edge information, the cutting edge research. We will be facilitating the debates and cutting edge discussions. We'll be holding big conferences around the country with different political viewpoints and different speakers, all figuring out how we can get out of the protest cage, how we can get out of the movement, out of the isolated trap of far left politics in the United States and to the masses. To the masses. How can we get to the masses? And, you know, I've been around the world. I've seen a lot of different things. I've seen people around the world in Venezuela who talk about what the socialist movement in Venezuela has meant to them. There was a woman in a collectivo in Venezuela who talked about the fact that, you know, she was a homeless child in Caracas, and she ended up getting adopted and you know, going to an orphanage by a socialist priest. She didn't even speak Spanish. She only spoke an indigenous language, but it was through the collectivo and the socialist cooperative that she was able to have a life and have a world. And I remember sitting there in Caracas in Venezuela and hearing this 19-year-old woman in army pants talk about how she was religious and she believed that God had sent her to the earth with a purpose, and that purpose was to die for socialism in Venezuela, and how that she was willing to give her life to it. And I remember hearing that, and I remember, you know, I went to Iran. And I remember, you know, I'm one of the few Americans who's actually been in the presence of the Ayatollah of Iran, the supreme leader. I was in an auditorium with 20,000 people. And these were not wealthy people. These were working class people, working class Iranians, screaming in adoration for Khamenei, because Khamenei had built an anti-imperialist revolution, and that he stood and protected the working class people of Iran from the Western capitalist imperialists. And seeing how the Iranians and those who were loyal to the Islamic Revolution of Iran just started to sob and cry when they saw Ayatollah Khamenei walk into the room. It was a big moment. I tell people that it is a unique experience to be the only American in a room of 20,000 people who are screaming death to America, and it's a moment where it forces you to realize that America and the United States around the world has become synonymous with capitalism and greed and war and the destruction of countries. And yes, this country was founded on the genocide of Native Americans. Yes, this country was founded on slavery. This country has murdered millions of people around the world in horrendous wars. But it was in that moment that I realized that as an American, I have a responsibility. I have a responsibility to not just light an American flag on fire and say, oh, look, I'm not an American. Yeah, I F this country. My responsibility was to show people around the world that there's another side to this country. That this country, at the same time there was slavery going on, there was a mass movement to abolish slavery. There was John Brown. There was Harriet Tubman. That at the same time, all these ugly wars were happening. There were people like Eugene V. Debs. There were people like Students for a Democratic Society who were going to prison to protest these criminal wars. That at the same time that all these evil things have happened, there has been a progressive and revolutionary side to the American people. And to figure out not how I can put on a costume and pretend to be Che Guevara or pretend to be Kim Il-sung or pretend to be Mao, but how instead I can find that progressive and revolutionary side of the American people and awaken it and let America stop being synonymous with imperialism and destruction and war, and awaken the American people, the people who have been suffering, the people who've been losing their jobs, the people who've been seeing their communities destroyed, who've seen the prison industrial complex, awaken the progressive side of the American people. How can we save America from the horror of capitalism? Because the same thing that the Wall Street monopolists and big international bankers have done to Africa and Asia and Latin America, they are doing to communities all throughout this country. Working class neighborhoods in America are being devastated right now by opioids, by unemployment, by a lack of investment in infrastructure. And the only way out of this is for the American people to awaken and rediscover the progressive side of American history. We need to awaken the sleeping giant called the American working class. And the way to do that is with solidarity. Solidarity against racism. Solidarity against wars around the world. The American people have a progressive side, and there is hope for doing all of this. Now, I said at the beginning of this presentation that I never want to say anything I do not know. But if I know something, I feel like I have an obligation to say it as loudly as I can. I don't know that this new model that we are developing for socialist organizing is actually going to work. I don't know that. I don't know that we are guaranteed to have success with everything we do. I don't know that. But what I do know is that if we are going to get out of the mess facing this country right now, the mess of political confusion and economic destruction, that we have to turn around. We have to turn around. And that at some moments, you reach a moment in your life sometimes where you're going to have to choose. And you're going to have to choose. All of us are going to have to choose. Are we going to continue to organize in the old way, or are we going to start engaging in political innovation? That is what my vision is for us to do. Now, I want to just end by talking about one thing, which is that I think that this pandemic has been particularly hard on a lot of us because of the fact that already in the United States, we're a very deeply alienated society. People are not connected with each other. People don't have a sense of community. People don't have a sense of belonging. There's a coldness. Families don't have the care for one another that they once had. Communities can feel like very alienating places. We're all encouraged to compete with each other. We're all encouraged to celebrate each other's failures, to mock each other, to lampoon each other. Everyone is competing with everyone else. Everyone looks down on other people. There's just an ugly atmosphere that's been created where just every form of division and isolation seems to be imposed on people. So if you add to that the fact that we're all social distancing right now, the fact that students are still having school from home in many parts of the country, the fact that we can't have big public gatherings, that the sense of community and the sense of oneness that human beings naturally long for has been so robbed from people. And there's so many people that are suffering right now. They're just in deep pain because they have lost their connections with other people. And it's hard for people because when it gets down to it, liberalism, the ideology that the Western capitalist system has really promoted, It believes that individualism should come before all else, that human beings should think of themselves as individuals. You can either speak of all humanity or you can speak of the individual, but you can never speak of the collective. You can never speak of the group, right? It breaks down any sense of group identity. And that this is completely foolish because human beings are collective creatures in nature. And not only are human beings collective creatures, but they are progressive creatures. You know, ants are collective creatures, but they have been building their ant farms the same way for thousands and thousands of years. Beavers are collective creatures. They've been building their beaver dams the same way for thousands and thousands of years. But human beings, not only are we collective, but it's through our collectivity that our brilliance is enacted. It's human beings coming together that took humanity from, caves to space travel, from rocks and dust to iPhones and iPads. Look at every building in the New York City skyline. Look at every great achievement that's been created. That is human beings coming together, collectively working together around a common vision to build something beautiful. We are a progressive species and we are a collective species. And the problem is that at this point, human beings, we have been infected with the free market and with capitalism, with the system of profits and command. And it's time for human reason and rational thinking to take control. That the word revolution itself, right? The word revolution, it originally referred to the fact that the earth is revolving around it, right? The earth revolves around the sun. That's the root of the word. And it was people who didn't go along with the Roman Catholic Church and their belief that the earth was the center of the universe. The people who called themselves revolutionaries were the people who believed in science and understood that actually the earth revolves. That's where the root of the word revolutionary came from. Now, after the events in France in the late 1700s, it became a political term, but originally it was a scientific term for how you understood the universe. And that points to the essence of what a revolution is. A revolution is not an act of violence and chaos. A revolution is not an act of destruction. Revolution is an understanding that science must be applied to humanity and that rational thinking can be applied to society, and society can be reorganized in a rational way. And that is what the word revolution means. The term revolution is about applying science to the human condition. And that's what the Center for Political Innovation aims to do, to apply science, scientific thinking, to how we can get out of this crisis. So I've said a lot in the past hour. I've said quite a bit, but I want to end, since I just told you that revolution has a very different meaning than what we're told. Now that I've explained the real meaning of the word revolution, I want to end the way I end all my lives by reciting a very, very important statement, one of the final statements of Chairman Mao Zedong, the author of the Little Red Book. He said, "A new upsurge in the struggle against U.S. imperialism is now emerging throughout the world. Ever since World War II, U.S. imperialism and its followers have been continuously launching wars of aggression. But the people of various countries have been continuously waging revolutionary wars to defeat their aggression. And while the danger of a new world war still exists, and the people of all countries must get prepared, revolution is the main trend in the world today."